So I'm joined today by Dr. Julian Perlmutter. Thanks for joining us, Julian. So Julian has written a book. We read one chapter of that book. The book is entitled Sacred Music, Religious Desire, and Knowledge of God, the Music of Our Human Longing. This book came out of a research project that he conducted while at the University of Cambridge. He was working there as an analytic philosopher within the Faculty of Divinity. And while he was there in Cambridge, he was also teaching philosophy and theology there, has since gone on to do a research fellowship at King's College London, and is now returning, or rather going for the first time, to Oxford University to train more as a teacher there. So again, thank you for joining us. Like I said, we've read one of your chapters of the book, chapter 5. And I wondered, before we dive into that chapter, if you could tell us a little bit about your approach to scholarship, specifically, like, how do you approach your work as an analytic philosopher?
Yeah, so philosophy in general asks the most fundamental and general questions. For example, if the physical sciences ask what temperature does water boil, philosophy will ask, is there such a thing as the material world and water, and what is knowledge anyway? Okay, so it's the questions that underpin all the other questions that we ask in other spheres of inquiry. Analytic philosophy is a branch of philosophy that developed in the 20th century, and mainly in the English-speaking world, so particularly in North America and in Britain. And it's a branch of philosophy that prizes clarity, rigor, and precision. So analytic philosophers try and construct clear lines of reasoning and eliminate as much ambiguity as possible from their work. They try and be rigorous, so really thorough. So they try to consider objections at every point. They try and respond to those objections. They try and go as deeply into what they're investigating as possible in as clear a way as possible. And they try and be as precise as they can as well. So they will often specify exactly what it is that they're trying to do and what they're not trying to do. They love definitions. So, defining terms is a very common thing to do if you're an analytic philosopher. And make distinctions as well. So if something is ambiguous or a bit unclear, an analytic philosopher will try and specify in as precise a way as possible what it is that we're talking about and what our aims are. Now, there are limits to analytic philosophy, and I think in something like questions about religion, clearly you're going to need more than simply the tools of clear, rigorous, precise logical analysis. And what I try and do in my book is to draw on other modes of engagement. So music is obviously the main one in the book. More broadly, you can draw on other artistic modes of engagement, emotional, imaginative, in order to try and answer these important questions. So in the book, I try and go beyond what analytic philosophy per se has often done, or how it's gone about its business. But fundamentally, I still see myself as an analytic philosopher. So I still try and hold on to this clarity, this rigor, and this precision in my work.
And so you were an analytic philosopher working in the Faculty of Divinity. I know from being there too, it's filled with a lot of theologians. It's specifically filled with a lot of Christian theologians. I wondered if you are a part of any, or rather, if you could tell us, are you a part of any faith tradition which kind of approached the way, like, obviously you wrote about the Christian tradition, and where would you situate yourself theologically, I guess, in that way?
Yeah, so I'm an agnostic, which means that I'm undecided or uncommitted either way on the question of whether God exists, or more broadly, whether there's any kind of divine reality. As a teenager, I was actually confirmed as a Christian into the Church of England. And then over the next few years, kind of drifted into agnosticism when it became clear to me that some of the difficult questions didn't have clear answers as I once thought they did. That said, I'm still very drawn to particularly the Christian outlook. as a vision for what the best is that human beings can be. So what is our ultimate goal? What's our ultimate fulfillment? Why are we here? The kind of vision for human life and the world more generally that Christianity presents is one that I find deeply attractive, particularly as it's been expressed in the artistic and cultural heritage of the church, of which sacred music is probably the aspect that I'm most drawn to.
I was going to ask, like, what brought your interest into sacred music, and belief, or we could say the struggle to have belief. I don't know how exactly you would want to describe that, but like, what is it that brought you in your own journey towards sacred music? Obviously, you wrote a book about it. You must have been pretty interested in
personally invested in it. Yeah. So I guess it was probably as a teenager at school that I first had the opportunity to sing in a choir. So I was not a boy chorister. I've always loved music, though, so yeah, at school as a teenager, I began to sing in choirs, and there was something about sacred music in particular that just kind of gripped me. So I remember one particular piece we sang in sixth form college, so I was about 17 years old, and it was a piece by the composer Vivaldi, and I just remember being completely captivated by this piece, turning to the guy next to me after we'd sung this like massive final chord and saying, "Wasn't that incredible?" And his reaction was just completely indifferent. And I remember thinking, okay, well, it's not everyone then, but speaking to other people through the years and in other choirs I've sung in, it is clear that sacred music does have this kind of effect and this kind of draw for lots of people. So that was what got me singing in choirs more regularly. And during my time at Cambridge for 4 years, I sang in the chapel choir of Trinity Hall.
Okay. And just thinking, because you mentioned Vivaldi, and so I'm not trained in music. I have no classical training, certainly. I've heard of Vivaldi. I wouldn't have necessarily thought Vivaldi is sacred music. Can you explain, like, what is it that makes music sacred versus just like, why is music sacred music versus just being music? Is there, like, where is that line? If there's
very good
a clear
question.
line, at least.
Yeah. So the easy answer is I don't think there is a clear line,
Okay.
and I deliberately in the book avoided offering a precise definition of sacred music because the main argument didn't depend on having a precise definition of sacred music. So the kind of music I focus on in the book, which is choral music in the Western classical tradition,
Right.
and in the church, that's a kind of completely uncontroversial example of music that is known as sacred. So everyone would classify that kind of music as sacred. And then there might be more borderline cases where there might be some disagreement. So, for example, is contemporary evangelical rock sacred? To take one example, I know from my own personal experience that different people I've spoken to have different answers to that question. So if I were to offer a rough characterization of what makes music sacred, it would be something like it evokes for the listener or for the singer a sense of the transcendent, i.e., a sense of some reality which may or may not exist, that goes beyond the physical world and that is beautiful and good in some kind of fundamental, powerful way. And obviously, if the definition is as broad as that, it doesn't have to just be, choral music with explicitly religious texts that's sacred. All sorts of music can be counted as sacred.
That's what I was just going to say. So sacred music doesn't have to be religious music.
Not explicitly religious music, right? No. I mean, I think that there is still a useful distinction to be drawn between sacred and non-sacred, in that music that is intentionally composed for the purpose I just described, perhaps we could call that sacred music in a kind of objective sense, because that's the reason music exists. Music that might have that effect, that kind of evoking of the transcendent for particular listeners, but wasn't composed with that intention, that might be kind of sacred in a more subjective sense to particular individuals. So that might be a useful distinction to have in mind.
Okay, yeah. So of course in your book, you focus not only on religious music, but specifically on Christian music. We'll return to that, I guess, well, for the whole conversation, really. But I was wondering if you could, so again, we've read chapter 5. Chapter 5 is one piece within the entire book. And I wondered if you could kind of give us a bird's eye view of the book insofar as then how does chapter 5 fit? I was particularly curious as a reader because I think maybe it was chapter 3 or something you referred to, but you're saying, well, earlier I spoke about the non-religious, and something, whether that was non-religious music or non-religious desire, I can't quite recall now, but I was very curious to understand how chapter 5 fits within the broader framework of the book. And I wondered if you'd be able to give us that bird's eye view.
Yeah, of course. So the book in general tries to offer an answer to the following question. So if one can't believe that the God of Christianity is real, but sees that at least as a possibility, a kind of live possibility worth taking seriously, how might that person cultivate openness to that God, such that if that God is real, one would eventually be able to receive the benefits? So it's a study of what I call interested non-belief, and I suppose that I would put myself in that category. I know that a number of other people would put themselves in that category as well, but that's the general concept that I have in mind throughout the book. The book is, it's not only addressed at the interested non-believer, but that's the specific sort of stance or situation I have in mind. So, if someone doesn't believe that the God of Christianity is real, can that person still cultivate an openness to that God who may or may not be real? And the answer I give is twofold. So my answer is that there's a particular kind of desire for God that can give the desirer some kind of knowledge of what God would be like in granting satisfaction. And that's obviously worked out in detail in chapter 5. And the other part of the answer is that a particularly good way of cultivating that kind of desire is through responding to sacred choral music in a particular way, and then taking that response into a practice of Christian contemplative prayer, which is what the last chapter is about through the writings of Thomas Merton.
What is the non-believer then? Because obviously often we hear about believers, like you're a part of a religious community, whether that's Christianity or any other religious community. And then we also are familiar with atheists. We are maybe, depending on our exposure, familiar with agnostics. What is the interested non-believer, and maybe how do they fit into all of those possible affiliations?
Yeah, so because it's a non-believer, it would be either an atheist or an agnostic. Right. The fact that the interested part means that the non-believer in question can't see God's existence as just impossible, because it's impossible to be interested in a worldview, in the sense of taking it seriously, if you think that it's definitely false. So the definitions of atheist and agnostic can get a bit blurry depending on what kind of atheist we're talking about, what kind of agnostic we're talking about, which is why I deliberately kind of tried to avoid that terminology, because different people understand those terms in different ways. But I guess so in the second chapter, or the first main chapter after the introduction, I do give a detailed characterization of interested non-belief. So it's got sort of three components. One is what the belief or non-belief is about. And I borrow from Charles Taylor there, who's a philosopher, Canadian philosopher, I believe, who describes the kind of core of the worldview here, the theistic worldview, as a kind of transcendent source of fullness, so a sort of transcendent reality in which humans find fullness of life. So that's what the belief is about, or non-belief is about, right? The second component is that although the person in question lacks belief in the reality just described, they'll see it as a live hypothesis. So that terminology is borrowed from the philosopher psychologist William James, writing in the late 19th, early 20th century. Live hypothesis means James describes it as making a sort of electric connection with you, right? So you know, when you hear this worldview described, something in you kind of lights up, and you take it seriously as a possibility. And of course, part of that will be seeing it as at least kind of, you know, somewhat plausible that it could be true, you know, rather than definitely false. But there's also a whole lot of other stuff that needs to be the case. So typically one needs to have grown up into a culture where that belief is, you know, is kind of fairly common currency. It needs to come naturally to someone as a possible way of kind of structuring their experience and interpreting things. So those are the first two components. The third component is just what attitude the interested non-believer should take towards the worldview in question. So it's not going to be one of belief, obviously, but there's got to be some kind of framing, you know, of the worldview. So what attitude should one take? And I suggest in this chapter 2 of the book, that one should hold an attitude of, first of all, hope. So one can hope that something is true even if one doesn't believe it's true. And secondly, what I call acceptance. Accepting something is resolving to treat it as true, even if one doesn't actually believe that it's true. So those three components together of interested non-belief give some idea of what it's about, and, you know, perhaps how it would relate to different kinds of atheism, different kinds of agnosticism.
Right. So hope and acceptance. Hope being, I can't think of a different word for it, like hoping that we might find that is indeed true, but acceptance at the same time saying we may never be able to verify this. Am I getting that right? So it's like there's a hopefulness that, you know, perhaps the world will unfold in such a way that I will find that this is, let's say, objectively true or factually true, but acceptance of the reality that we might never have that verification. Is that a fair summary of hope and acceptance?
Yeah. So here's an example of acceptance, right? So so, and in fact, what I'll do is I'll just read out the example from the first chapter, because it's because this is from the philosopher William Alston. So acceptance isn't my term; it's a term that's been used by other philosophers. So William Alston illustrates acceptance as follows. Okay, so he says, consider an army general whose forces are facing enemy forces with a battle imminent. He needs to proceed on some assumption as to the disposition of those forces. His scouts give some information about this, but not nearly enough to make any such assumption obviously true, or even overwhelmingly probably true. So what does he do? He accepts the hypothesis that seems to him the most likely of the alternatives, though he realizes that he is far from knowing that this or any other such hypothesis is true. He uses this as a basis for disposing his forces in the way that seems most likely to be effective, even though he's far from believing that this is the case. So he doesn't know what the enemy forces are going to be doing, right? He needs to proceed, however, on some kind of assumption as to what those forces are going to be doing, right? So he accepts, he assumes that the most likely assumption is going to be true, right? The most likely hypothesis is going to be true, even though he doesn't have enough evidence for that for him to form the belief that it's true, right? So accepting something is, if you have a degree of confidence in it that falls short of belief, it's still resolving to use that idea as a basis for your action, for your thinking, for your emotion, for your feeling, right? So it might be the case that it's eventually verified, or it might not be. But that's what accepting is. It's sort of voluntary, embracing of a view, even though you don't know whether it's true or not.
So would it be fair to say that accepting is to intentionally stop questioning or to stop interrogating? I don't want to say stop doubting, because maybe doubt still can exist in that unbelief state. But yeah, acceptance sounds to me like, okay, we are no longer constantly interrogating whether or not this is true or not, bringing forward the facts, bring me the evidence, let me weigh it, let me assess, right? It's okay, I accept this, I have enough, whether it's reason or whether it's hope or whether it's a combination, I have enough, things which are making me want to accept it. So there, I accept it for at least for the time being, right? I'm no longer going to continually interrogate it.
I think it could be that. So one might accept something and decide to, put one's inquiries to rest. But accepting in that sense is definitely compatible with continuing to interrogate a worldview, right? So, you can decide to, it depends on the situation, right? So obviously in the case of the, accepting some hypothesis about what the enemy forces are going to be doing, once you've decided how to act, kind of that's it, it's irreversible, right? But if we're talking about something like a religious worldview, you can accept a religious worldview in the sense of resolving to use that worldview as a basis for your reasoning, your action, and your feeling. But you can still be constantly, looking for evidence for or against the worldview. You can keep an open mind. So I'd say acceptance is definitely compatible with still inquiring and interrogating the worldview.
So at the very beginning of chapter 5, you write, and I'll just read it here, that the human yearning for God might far outpass the human telling, which I took to mean that there are certain, like, we are unable to articulate some levels of that very yearning that some of us, and we'll return later why I'm strict on saying some of us. I don't necessarily think that we all do have that desire that is fundamental to the chapter, but we'll return to that. But yeah, the human yearning for God might outpass the human telling.
So the reason why I thought that was an appropriate kind of starting note for the chapter was because the kinds of desire for God that I'm discussing in the chapter are, by their very nature, because they're musically evoked desires, they're not desires that you can just kind of pass on, in a sort of purely verbal sense, right? So that's why the music is so important. To form the desire and to know what it's like to have the desire in question, one needs to have had that conveyed to one by each of the pieces I discuss. So in that sense, the desire is beyond at least verbal human telling. Okay, so these texts that are set to the music, I think the fact that they're set to the music kind of brings out sort of dimensions and layers of them that you wouldn't necessarily get just from the text themselves. But there is lots of poetry that, in my opinion at least, doesn't have to be set to music in order to have its kind of evocative power. But again, the interesting point here is that the desire is kind of illustrated or shown in some way through a particular artistic medium, poetry or music, rather than simply being described in a kind of dry, statement of fact kind of way. So that's the sense in which I think desire for God, anyway, is often, or even usually, beyond the power of human telling, if human telling is taken to mean just a kind of purely factual description of what the desire is for. However, in the chapter, of course, the aim is to take these desires that are supposed to be evoked by these pieces of music and then interrogate them philosophically. Okay, what would it take for these desires to be satisfied? What attributes would God need in order to satisfy those desires? But it's so important to listen to the pieces in question alongside reading the chapter, and there are recordings referenced in the endnotes of the book. And that's not just an optional extra. One needs to have those pieces in mind when one is reading about them.
It's interesting to me to know that you are agnostic. Desire for God is, of course, being explored through this Christian lens. I wondered whether you're able to speak. And, it would have been wonderful to almost have a panel of people who are interested in sacred music who have explored it from other traditions right now. Maybe we could have, a Buddhist here, a Jain here, a spiritual but not religious person here. But I wonder if from your perspective, you're able to speak to like how does desire for God, how does using sacred music to desire God, what does that look like if it's not exclusively wrapped up in a Christian lens, even if approached as an agnostic mindset, right? It's still in a Christian lens, which it's not that I struggle to comprehend it, but it kind of is, it's something that sticks out to me. Like, why not approach it as an agnostic? Like, I don't know what that would look like. What is the agnostic God, right? But yeah, like, why is the agnostic using Christianity to explore a desire for God? I suppose that's the question.
So the question, why the Christian lens? Is that
why the Christian lens, but also more broadly, like what would it look like, or is it possible to articulate what it would look like to desire God outside of a Christian lens tradition?
So okay, well, I'll take those sort of two questions in turn. So the first one, why the Christian lens? So it's certainly not based on a kind of assumption that somehow Christianity is, the most worthy of our attention or engagement or anything like that. I suppose there are two main reasons for that lens. The first is that it's what I'm most familiar with, having been brought up in a broadly Christian culture, although I was never forced to go to church or anything, but that's the kind that it was in the water, as it were. It's part of the cultural heritage of my upbringing, and of course, it's best to write about what you're most familiar with, at least in a lot of cases, because you can have more to say about.
To write a book, yes, I agree completely.
If I tried to write about, say, Buddhist musical traditions, I'd probably have a lot less to say on them, and it would be a less kind of interesting book. The second reason, though, quite apart from my own personal history with Christianity, is that it is true that Christianity, through the church tradition of choral music, provides a really rich example or kind of case study, if you like, of how the general argument could go. So the general argument being that desire for God gives one a certain kind of knowledge of God, and that desire can be evoked by sacred music. And because there's such such riches of sacred music in the choral tradition of Christianity, there was great material that I could draw on all this material in order to illustrate this general argument. But I certainly don't rule out the possibility of applying the general argument to other religious traditions, or at the very least other theistic traditions. So I guess this kind of segues into the second part of your question. What would it look
I'm glad you
like,
added that caveat, that theistic traditions, theistic meaning that there is a God.
Exactly.
There is an object God or a subject God, however it would be said.
Yeah, there is a God. Could be defined in slightly different ways, but I would take theism to be the belief that there is a God with all the omni attributes. So omnipotent, all powerful, omnibenevolent, perfectly good, omniscient, all knowing, a perfect God, basically, and a God, moreover, who is a personal God. So the general argument is that one has knowledge of God through desiring God. So there's nothing in principle, I would have thought, that would rule out that general argument being applied to, say, Judaism or Islam, the other Abrahamic traditions. My knowledge of Jewish music and Islamic music is far less than my knowledge of Christian music, so I wouldn't want to go too into detail. And I know that, for example, in Islam, there's a complex relationship with music. It's not always unequivocally accepted. So perhaps how that argument would work out in, for example, those two traditions might look quite different in its details, or even its broad brush strokes, from how it would work out in a Christian context. But at the very least, the idea that in desiring God, you have a sense of what God would be like in satisfying the desire, that could almost certainly be applied to definitely the other Abrahamic traditions, and possibly versions of the Eastern religions as well.
Yeah,
but
I'm thinking some strands of Hinduism could fall within that. Some would very much not fall within
Yeah.
it.
Yeah, I think it's, yeah, you get more complex when you get into something like Hinduism, because it's not a straightforwardly theistic religion, obviously. So yeah.
Yeah, so you're a non-believer, you're an agnostic, but you're studying through a tradition in order to arrive at these questions, or to work through these questions rather.
Yeah.
So
And I think that just on your point, sorry, on could an agnostic engage with religious questions simply as an agnostic and not through any religious tradition? I think probably in some kind of dry intellectual sense, one could do that. One could sort of construct a concept of what God would be like, and then ask various kind of intellectual questions about that God. But I think in terms of engaging with religious questions in a kind of personally invested way, I struggle to see how that could be the case, because because the various religious traditions offer such rich resources, musical, poetic, literary, liturgical, that's been shaped by centuries of devotion. And it just seems to me that any kind of personally invested search is sooner or later going to want to engage with, for example, art or music or poetry, because that's been written by people who have also been personally invested in it.
Yeah. And I think, again, it's interesting to kind of reiterate that religious questioning is not necessarily about doctrine alone. Like, it's not about, do I believe this or do I not believe this? I think it could take a much broader kind of philosophical realm of questioning about like life's big questions, like who am I? How do I relate to others in this world? What is my meaning on this earth? What happens when I die? How do I love well? Like all of these questions, which I think are, if we take even a moment to pause and reflect on them, like they are the driving forces behind our existence. Like they are what make us alive, or deeply alive, at least I would say. They don't have to come into the realm through a religious vocabulary. They don't have to be like, well, do I believe, to borrow from Christian traditions, like, do I believe that, Jesus did this action however many years ago on this earth, right? Like those aren't necessarily the kinds of religious questions one has to entertain and try to answer. It can be these bigger, we could call them existential questions, or questions of meaning, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, these questions, the kinds of fundamental questions that you've described, have religious answers and they have non-religious answers. For example, the "why am I here" question. A theistic answer will be, well, I'm here because I'm lovingly created by God, or something like that, and and God desires union with me and relationship with me. A non-religious answer would be, well, I'm here because of an accident of various kind of physical forces, and now I have to somehow find my own meaning and value in my life. And I think so it's definitely important to recognize these questions don't have to be explored through any kind of religious lens. I think to disregard any kind of religious answers just completely, just to kind of dismiss them out of hand, would be a shame, and it would probably impoverish one's inquiry and exploration, because these answers that have been offered by the various religious traditions of the world are ones that have deeply satisfied people for centuries and millennia. So just to dismiss out of hand the possibility that one could find some kind of satisfying, including intellectually satisfying, place in a religious tradition would seem to me to be premature. So I think I'd say that I'd want to keep both religious and non-religious avenues open in exploring those questions.
Yeah, I think it can often happen that if we are exposed to a certain form of religion, if we think that religion looks a certain way, acts a certain way, makes certain rules or requests of our lifestyles, etc., we can become, very turned off from exploring the teachings offered by that religious tradition. But like you say, it feels like an impoverishing to not at least consider them, right? You can kind of consider them through your own lens and through your own eyes. You don't need to accept you don't need to take on all of that doctrine in order to explore a certain facet of it, right?
No, absolutely not. I mean, and I recognize that I've been fairly fortunate in, whatever aspects of my upbringing were religious. They were definitely not of the kind of off-putting
I'm gonna say
kind.
they didn't turn you away. They didn't cause. They
I
didn't.
was I was never taught that I'd go to hell for X, Y, and Z. I was never taught that you have to be a Christian in order to be saved. I was never, I was never taught that there are kind of obviously right or wrong answers, and accepting those answers.
I want to turn to the pieces themselves, the four that you selected. You chose them for a few reasons. One is that at least if someone were familiar with choral music, they might already have heard these. They might be familiar with them. Or if they're embedded into a Christian tradition, they might be familiar with the texts that they come from. You also say they have interesting comparisons that can be drawn between them. And then you also indicate that they cover a fairly broad time span, at least as far as Western classical music is considered. I wondered if there are other reasons that weren't listed, specifically if there were any kind of personal inklings toward any of those pieces for reasons, or maybe there aren't. But yeah, if there are other kind of personal reasons that drew you to them, would you be able to share any of those?
No, absolutely. I mean, it's very difficult to write about pieces in this kind of context when you're not personally drawn to the pieces. So, so the Purcell piece, "Hear My Prayer, O Lord," that was actually what gave me the initial kind of seed of an idea for the book. So we were singing it in concert in Trinity Hall Chapel Choir. We were on tour in Brittany, and I just remember, once we finished the piece, the sheer kind of depth of like desperation and longing in that piece just seemed so primal. Like it didn't depend on whether one subscribed to this or that doctrine, right? It was somehow more fundamental than that. It was more a core of what it is to be human, to reach out to something beyond the natural world in times of sheer desperation. I thought, okay, there's something interesting to be said here, that the power of the piece, of a piece of sacred music, doesn't depend on whether or not you believe that God is real or that Christianity is true. So that piece just seemed like a very obvious one to include in the end.
Okay.
The next piece, Abendlied by Joseph Reinberger. So that's been a piece I've loved for years. I think I first sang it when I was maybe 16 or 17, and it's always struck me as, and I try and draw attention to this in the description of the piece. There's this kind of this combination of wistfulness and also warmth in the piece. So it's got this kind of aching, yearning quality.
The word that stuck out to me when I read your description was like there's a tenderness there. Like there's an ache, but it's also very tender.
Yeah, so it's definitely a kind of yearning, but it's very different from the Purcell kind of desperation yearning. It's a kind of there's more of a tenderness to it. It more perhaps hints at a kind of intimate union with God as something that would satisfy the yearning. But the reason why I think it's wistful as well is because of the text that's set to it and the context in which it's often sung. So stay with us, for it is towards evening and the day is far spent. It's a little quote from the Gospel of Luke. In the Gospel of Luke, that line does not mean what it seems to mean in the piece. So in the Gospel of Luke, it's when two disciples are walking to Emmaus alongside the risen Christ. They don't recognize the risen Christ as Christ. And the risen Christ kind of, pretends he's going to go on further. And these two disciples, in this kind of spontaneous, generosity, they say, no, stay with us. It's towards evening and the day is far spent. They're basically inviting him in as a guest to where they're staying. But in the piece, it that sort of takes on this whole other layer of meaning. Stay with us, for it's towards evening. Obviously, kind of metaphorical connotations there: evening, darkness, suffering, death, even. So it's a kind of plea for God to be present in those kinds of times. So that's why I think there's this kind of wistfulness. It's this recognition that human life often doesn't turn out for the best. There are dark times in human life, and it's a kind of longing or a yearning for God to be intimately present in those times and to assure one that all will be well ultimately. So that's why I love that piece, and I think that combination of tenderness and wistfulness is very powerful. And finally, the settings of the Nunc Dimittis. So those settings are ones that we sang in the chapel choir at Trinity Hall. They're a fairly sort of standard staple of the Anglican choral repertoire. So they're sung in lots of evensong services throughout the country, cathedrals and college choirs, and I was particularly drawn to the contrast between these two pieces, and at the same time sort of similarities. So the Stanford, there's this both pieces are sung by soloists accompanied by the choir, and in the Stanford there's this mixture of kind of awe-inspiring, almost kind of wide open eyes, looking towards God's glory, particularly on the word glory. There's this massive chord. It's like it just kind of blows everything apart, and but then it's all leading towards the Gloria at the end. Glory be to the Father, and to the Son, and to the Holy Spirit, as it was in the beginning, is now, and ever shall be, world without end. Amen. And those words in the Stanford are set to this lovely, sort of almost sort of hushed, reverent, kind of peaceful music, and one just wants to sort of stay absolutely still and just listen to its kind of, it's the kind of the music that sort of draws you in. You don't want to miss a second of it. And to me, that was always, again, very powerful in this very kind of intimate way. The idea that you could express divine glory in such an intimate way that seemed to kind of fit the words. And then finally, the howls. It's my favorite setting of the Nunc Dimittis text. And again, the piece leads towards the end, towards the Gloria. And the Gloria is just, it's just ecstatic. I mean, it's no matter how many times I hear that, it doesn't lose any of its power. It's just this outpouring of praise, and quite right. I mean, ultimately, as I try and argue in the chapter, these pieces are looking towards, if not in the text, then definitely the music, are looking towards what might lie on the far side of death and the full unfolding of salvation. And it's entirely appropriate that we should have something like Howells's setting of the Gloria, which is just absolutely magnificent and ecstatic. And for me, it's like being submerged in something of what the Christian tradition says will happen after death. It's a hint of what might be to come. So that's why that piece is very powerful to me. And the four pieces together, I think, offer very good illustrations of the general argument, both in the kind of similarities and the differences that can be drawn between them.
I want us to talk about when you draw the correlation between satisfaction, which you talk about it as it's something that we can imagine based on former experiences of having a desire, being met, feeling satisfied. So the correlation between satisfaction and gaining knowledge. In this particular context, the knowledge gained is the object of our desire, right? So the thing that we were, wanting, and then imagining the satisfaction of, we gain knowledge of it. So in this sense, or rather in your chapter's context, there's a connection between satisfaction and knowing more about God. I wondered first if I've understood that correlation correctly, but I also wondered if you might be able to walk me through that correlation with a couple of examples. So again, like experiencing something through imagination, a sense of satisfaction, we begin to learn more about that thing that we have been imagining being satisfied by. What is that relationship like?
So do you want like a non-religious example or a religious example?
If you can start me with a non-religious, I think that will be a helpful way in. Yeah.
Okay. So in chapter 3, which is the chapter I refer back to a few times, that's when all this is sort of developed in detail with non-religious examples. So the most basic kind of example, which bear with me, this is going to sound very far from desire for God, right? The most basic kind of example is desire for food or for drink, a particular kind of food or drink. So if I desire a bowl of strawberries, let's say I've had strawberries in the past, right? So I know what strawberries taste like. If I desire a bowl of strawberries, then I have a particularly strong sense while I'm desiring them of what they would taste like were I to have them, were I to eat them. Okay, so it's like if you desire something or a particular food strongly enough, it's like you can practically taste it, right? The desire kind of heightens your sense of what it tastes like, right? So in terms of the components of how this knowledge works that you've just described, so I desire the strawberries. In that desire, I form a sense of what it would take to be satisfied. In particular, in order to be satisfied, I'd have to taste the strawberries and I'd have to bite down on them and chew them and swallow them. That sense, in this case, this very straightforward case, is formed from past experience of, that exact same, process of eating strawberries, right? So that's how I know what it would take for the desire to be satisfied. In that sense of what it would take to be satisfied, I form some knowledge of what strawberries are like in terms of how they're important to me. So in order for me to have the experience that would constitute satisfaction, namely the experience of eating strawberries would have to have a particular taste, they'd have to have a particular texture, they'd have to be juicy and red and ripe. So those are attributes that strawberries would have to have in order to satisfy me. So in desiring strawberries and having that sense of what it would take to be satisfied, I thereby come to know about strawberries in those respects, in their, their taste, their texture, maybe even their color, in a very sort of vivid way, and a way that brings home to me their significance to me, right? So it's not just a kind of abstract knowledge of what strawberries are like. It's not even a kind of general knowledge of what they taste like. It's a knowledge of what they taste like, what they feel like, and how those things are important to me as the desirer, right? So that's how that would work in what sounds like a very mundane case, strawberries. In that chapter, I also talk about two other kinds of non-religious desires. So desire for resolution to musical tension. So if one hears a particular chord, say a dominant seventh, one longs for that to be resolved onto the tonic. And in hearing that dominant seventh chord, one can practically hear as well what the tonic would have to sound like in order to constitute that satisfaction. And you kind of run the example through in a similar way to the strawberries case. And finally, I consider interpersonal desire, in particular romantic desire. So now this is getting away from purely kind of physical desire, such as a desire for strawberries, and it's more a desire for, quite a sort of complex experience or set of experiences with another person. And I try and show that the same basic kind of structure, if you like, can apply even to those kinds of desires. So you form a sense of what it would take to be satisfied. That sense might be based on past romantic relationships, or it might be based on analogous relationships, relationships where one has had some kind of love and closeness. It might be family relationships, it might be relationships with friends. So obviously there's going to be a difference there, but there's some similarity. There's something for one to sort of to go on. And in forming a sense of what it would take to be satisfied, one knows in some kind of personally significant, vivid way what the person in question would have to be like in order to bring about that satisfaction. So if one thinks that to be satisfied, one would have to enjoy a certain kind of personal intimacy, let's say, if it's romantic desire, in order to satisfy that desire, one would have to be, perhaps we could say affectionate, attentive, capable of intimacy, all those sorts of things. So again, those attributes now come into focus particularly clearly through the desire as attributes that matter to one and, personally significant. So, I know how being affectionate and capable of intimacy and being loving matter to me in the context of having that desire. So those are three non-religious examples of how the desire is supposed to work in terms of giving one knowledge. And my hope is that in chapter 5, I show that desire for God can follow that general structure, that general process, in order to satisfy the conditions of knowledge developed in chapter 3.
I see. one question I have, which I'm gonna verbalize it, but I'm gonna ask that we then move on to my next question after we verbalize it, just because of time, um, just to kind of have it in the air here. In the strawberries example and in the other examples, one has former knowledge and former experience.
Hmm.
Um, it feels, especially for the interested non-believer, that they wouldn't have a former experience of God. So I wonder how that works together. But unfortunately, I'm going to do the horrible thing where I ask you to allow that to pass into the air so that all of us can consider it. But
It's
just
answered in the chapter as well. So
it doesn't.
yeah.
There you go. Yeah, done. So there was a moment where you gave a rather tongue-in-cheek piece of advice to Augustine.
Yeah. Augustine. Yeah.
Augustine. Okay. You paint him as being maybe a little too concerned with the possibility that he might be sinning because he enjoyed the music, right? You kind of tell him like, chill out, calm down. You're allowed to enjoy music. It's fine. But this was, of course, in a broader concern that you were summarizing that the Christian church had had over different time periods and sometimes continues to have, where there is a fear that music, like the melodies of music, could actually detract the listener from the lyrics, like insinuating that the lyrics are the most important part. The melody is just a vehicle for the lyric. And you seem to arrive at a conclusion that both words and melodies offered something very helpful. And I wondered, helpful as far as going through the journey of learning about God. I wondered if there's room to push back and almost say, like, do we need the lyrics? Do the lyrics have to be there? Like, what if someone were just listening to music which moved them? I'm recalling the beginning of our call where you spoke about like being moved to reflect deeply on the transcendent, not even necessarily saying the Christian God or anything like that. Contemplation is something in this course we're very it's at the forefront of our consideration. Just being moved into a state of contemplation, does that still count as sacred music? Might that still be something that we could benefit from in terms of a contemplative exercise? Or where would you fall in that?
So I definitely, so was the question about, music where either without words or where one doesn't understand the words, can that still lead one into a kind of contemplation?
Yeah, if there are no words, or if there's a foreign language being sung, we might not understand the words, can that still lead us into contemplation? Can that still give us the benefit of sacred music?
So the short answer, I think, is yes, it certainly can. The reason why I was focusing on sacred music where one understands either the text or at least the general theme of the piece, if it's in a foreign language, say, the reason why I was focusing on that kind of experience was because the text offers particular conceptual content that can feed into one's response. So, for example, to take the Purcell piece, the desire that's expressed in that piece is partly shaped by the text. Hear my prayer, O Lord, and let my crying come unto thee. Right? It's desperation. In order for desire to play the role that I'm describing in the book, this kind of knowledge-giving role, there has to be a kind of conceptual element to it, because it has to be for God in a particular capacity, right? But of course, that's not the only kind of religious desire or even desire for God that one can have. And I would say it's certainly possible to respond to music either without text at all or sung in a text that one doesn't understand at all, and be moved into a kind of contemplative state. And I guess by contemplative state, I mean a state where one is attending in a particularly close or a particularly deep way to what one perceives. So, all sorts of music can do that. And I wouldn't want to limit that at all to sacred music with words. But sacred music with words was necessary in the context of the particular kind of desire for God that I was talking about.
So my final question, and this is, kind of coming directly back to the theme of this course, contemplation and well-being, especially because noting that the texts on which these sacred pieces are based, noting that they express suffering, they express absence, they express longing, they express, like this dark night of the soul kind of state. We are talking about contemplation and well-being, and I wondered if you might be able to offer us any kind of words or thoughts that you have as far as the relationship between contemplation as far as sacred music goes and well-being. Like, how are those two things correlated? What is the relationship between the two? Do you have any thoughts to share from the realm of sacred music?
Yeah, so I think the answer to this question will depend on what we mean by contemplation and what we mean by well-being. So my understanding is
Spoken
that,
like the true analytic philosopher.
yeah, this is an example of the clarity and precision that analytic philosophers prize. So let's get our definition straight. No, so my understanding is that in the course, the word contemplation is taken in a very broad sense. So I've got a dictionary definition in front of me here, and the definitions that seem to match the sort of course definition would be either the action of looking thoughtfully at something for a long time, or deep reflective thought. Does that sound about right?
That's the one that we are using. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So contemplation has, in the context that I'm considering it, particularly in the final chapter, a meaning that's perhaps a version of that, but more specific. So the dictionary definition here that I've got for religious and specifically Christian contemplation is a form of Christian prayer or meditation in which a person seeks to pass beyond mental images and concepts to a direct experience of the divine. Okay. Now, obviously, that's going to involve the action of looking, and of course, that's being used in an analogous way now, thoughtfully at something for a long time, right? Looking at God or attending to God for a long time. And it's well known in the Christian tradition that this kind of contemplation can often lead to states that don't look very much like well-being at all. So you mentioned the dark night of the soul, for example. If we take someone like St. John of the Cross, writing in the 16th century, John of the Cross says that Christian contemplation will sometimes result in basically deep trauma, right? So one is being kind of uprooted from one's habitual ways of valuing the world and engaging with the world, and one will feel completely lost, because the things that used to make sense no longer make sense, right? So, however, when put in the kind of broader narrative of what this is for, which is ultimately union with God, it turns out that sort of stage, the night of the soul or the night of the spirit, was necessary because one had to be uprooted from one's ways of engaging with the world, in some sense of substituting the world from God. One had to kind of be rid of that in order to receive God as God is, right? So that's just one answer to the question in a particularly Christian contemplative context, where actually the relationship between contemplation as well and well-being is, ultimately contemplation is our final flourishing, direct knowledge of God and love of God and union with God. But the way to get there often doesn't look very much like well-being at all. And I'm aware that, of course, if we take contemplation and well-being in different, definitions, for example, the broader definition that you have in the course, it might look quite different. Secular mindfulness, for example, which bears some kind of resemblance to Christian meditation, would probably conceive of the relationship between those two things in quite a different way.
There might still be those, I would say at least there are often still those very bumpy moments to get there. It's not that there is a quick jump from contemplation to well-being, because, and I like the way you put it, is that in the process of contemplation, it doesn't have to happen this way, but very often we are uprooting everything we feel familiar with. And we, as human beings, we love familiarity. We love things to feel like, that's what gives us comfort, is when things feel familiar. And there's a whole kind of discipline of psychology which has looked into that in more detail, which affects, like, our trauma affects our preferences in so many ways. We are still drawn to things which feel familiar, even if they are bad for us. We're so drawn to the familiar, and in the act of contemplation, we can radically uproot everything which feels familiar and comfortable, which is going to be very unsettling for the vast majority of humans, right? We don't like that. We do not like that. No. But it is a step in the journey, right? It is not the end of the journey. It's a step to arrive elsewhere, right?
And I think, you know, contemplation in the broader sense of deep reflection or attention to something, it is, I think it's, you know, it's very clear, particularly in, you know, the world of instant gratification, social media, all that kind of stuff. We're in real danger of losing our capacity to attend deeply to things. So just to come round to the aspect of your question, what can sacred music contribute to contemplation and well-being in this broader sense? Well, at the very least, you know, if you go to, say, an evensong and you sit there and actually attend to the choral music, you know, without looking at your phone, say, you will be sort of transported just temporarily to a space in which nothing else matters. And I think that kind of deep attention is incredibly valuable, both in itself, you know, that is in itself a form of well-being, to be able to do that, and also because, to use a horrible phrase, it's a kind of transferable skill. You know, if you can do that for music or art or nature, you might also be able to do that for other people, you know. So I think that just in a sort of purely secular way and a much broader way than the Christian, you know, approach that I outlined earlier, there is a clear connection between contemplation and well-being.
Yeah, it's an attunement to the present moment, right? When you're talking about that
Exactly.
transferable skill, how do you be fully present? Whether that's to the music that you are having wash over you at evensong, or whether that's in the conversation you're having with a friend. Being in that present.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
Well, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.